And Councilor Martin, we are now live.
Thank you. This special meeting of the Committee of the Whole Community Development is now called to order. I would ask you to rise as you are able for the reading of the invocation. As we come together today, we recognize the great responsibilities laid upon us. Our council will always strive to understand the needs of the people we serve and to use power wisely and well. Our purpose is to establish and maintain a city of prosperity and righteousness where freedom prevails and where justice rules. Let us also not forget those who served our community and who are no longer with us, so that we can continue to do the work we must in their memory. Now, if the clerk would call the roll, please.
Councilor Weaver,
Present.
Councilor Martin,
Here.
Councilor Vanderstelt,
Present.
Councilor Van Tilburg,
Present.
Councilor Wall,
Present.
Councilor McCreary,
Here.
Councilor Utley,
Here.
Councilor
Here.
Sless,
Present.
Councilor Carpenter.
Here.
Thank you. And tonight we have Julie Sippel as our clerk, and Jennifer Page is assisting with the meeting. Members of the committee, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest for items appearing on the agenda? Seeing none, I would just like to remind the committee and our viewing public of a few of the procedural rules for our virtual meetings in operating as efficiently as possible. All members will be muted for the meeting to reduce feedback. All web cameras for committee members shall be turned on. Staff will be requested to join the video meeting should the need to answer questions of members of the committee arise. Any member of committee should indicate they wish to speak by pressing the raised hand button on the bottom of your screen. Clerk staff will lower the hand when you have been recognized by the chair for your speaking opportunity. In the event a connection service interruption occurs that affects quorum of the Committee of the Whole, we may recess the meeting for up to 15 minutes to regain quorum. If quorum is not achieved, the meeting will be adjourned. All members of the committee participating via online video conference will vote using eScribe, and the clerk will announce the vote results. Members of the public who registered as delegates or under the statutory public hearings are able to take part electronically via webcam or via the telephone for the meetings. All rules for delegations under the city's procedural bylaw continue to apply. We'll now commence with the public meeting with respect to the proposal, the 2021 Area Specific Development Charges Bylaw. This public meeting is being held pursuant to the Development Charges Act 1997 to provide sufficient information so that interested parties may generally understand the review, the background study, the report, and the proposed bylaw, which would establish development charges applicable to the northern boundary expansion lands and Tutela Heights in the City of Brantford. Members of the public in attendance will be provided the opportunity to make representation to the committee regarding these matters. Please note that the names of those individuals who speak will appear within the meeting's minutes. Anyone wishing notification of any further proceedings should send their name and address to the clerk. Pursuant to Section 12 of the Development Charges Act, notice of this public meeting was published in the Civic News on Thursday, March 4th, 2021. A copy of the Development Charges Background Study has been available online through the city's website since February 26, 2021. The proposed bylaw has been available for 2 weeks prior to this meeting. In accordance with the provisions of the Development Charges Act 1997, RSO 1997 C27I, if oral submissions have not been made at this public meeting or any written submissions logged with the clerk before a decision is reached, should an appeal be made to the decision of council, the local planning appeal tribunal may dismiss the appeal. Craig Binning and Julia Cesari of Hempson Consulting will be speaking first as the city's consultant. Following the presentation, members of the public will then be invited to speak, followed by clarification by staff or the consultant if required. If we could have the presenters come forward, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again. If we could just go ahead to the next slide, please. So the purpose of this meeting is a statutory public meeting as required by Section 12 of the Development Charges Act. The primary purpose is to provide the public with an opportunity to make representation on the proposed 2021 area-specific development charges, or ASDC, background study and bylaw pertaining to the boundary expansion lands. As was stated previously, the background study was made publicly available on February 26th, and the ASDC draft bylaw was made available on March 16th. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background. About 2,700 hectares were annexed from Brant County in 2017. We did assist the city in undertaking an interim DC study in 2019, and that bylaw is still in force and imposes citywide charges for various general and engineered services. At the time of the 2019 study, however, servicing needs of the expansion lands were not fully known. Now, with completion of the official plan, master servicing plan, and transportation master plan, we have a much better idea of what those servicing needs are, and the city wants to ensure that those costs are recovered by the benefiting development. So development pressures are imminent with the provincial approval of the official plan coming up. And so the city is moving forward with an area-specific development charge bylaw for the northern boundary expansion area and the Tutela Heights area at this time. Next slide, please. So the ASDC rates address the area-specific engineered infrastructure of roads and related services, water services, wastewater services, and stormwater. The existing citywide DC rates for all general services and engineered services would also continue to apply to those areas. We are working with the city to update the citywide DC background study and bylaw, and that is expected to follow in Q3 of this year. Next slide, please. So the ASDC background study covers off two benefiting areas. The first is the northern boundary expansion area to the north, and then we have the Tutela Heights area to the south, which includes a small boundary expansion area as well as an existing settlement area that has significant growth-related servicing needs that have been captured. Next slide, please. So our study covers the full planning horizon to 2051, and over that 2021 to 2051 timeframe, this is the growth that staff are anticipating within the two ASDC areas. So in the northern boundary expansion lands, we're looking at about 7,700 dwelling units, accommodating about 23,000 people. And then we have just under 15,000 jobs and about 1.3 million square meters in non-residential space. And then in Tutela Heights, we're looking at about 1,200 dwelling units, about 3,700 people, 90 jobs, and just under 5,000 square meters of space. Next slide, please. So the capital programs for engineered services have been developed in close consultation with city staff. So they are based on the new transportation master plan and master servicing plan, and they include those 4 engineered services that I mentioned. The capital costs are adjusted in accordance with DC legislation, so we've accounted for any anticipated grants or direct developer contributions, any replacement shares or benefit to existing development shares, which I will get into on the next slide. And now just showing some of the details of the capital programs. And again, further detail is available within the background study, which is posted on the city's website. And not to spend too much time, but the overall capital program specific to the northern boundary expansion lands totals $335 million in costs. This includes things like a new east-west collector road in the area and area-specific water distribution and sewage collection needs. Of that $335 million, we expect a small amount to be covered by direct developer contributions. An amount of $85 million is deemed as replacement shares or related to existing development. And then another $21 million is deemed to benefit development beyond the 2051 planning horizon. So that has also been deducted. And after all of those deductions, about $230 million is brought forward to the ASDC calculation for the northern boundary expansion lands. Next slide, please. In Tutela Heights, the capital program is smaller. We do not have any area-specific roads projects here, but we are recovering for various area-specific water, wastewater, and stormwater projects. The total gross costs are about $18 million, and then after deducting benefit to existing and post-period shares, we're left with under $15 million brought forward to the ASTC calculation. And then just moving on. And now here are our calculated rates broken down by service area. So in the northern area in green there, we are looking at an ASTC of just under $26,000 per single or semi-detached unit and $93 per square meter of non-residential floor space. And then after adding in the citywide charges, which will continue to apply under the current bylaw, the total charge that would apply in this area would be just under $50,000 per single detached unit, or $173 per square meter of non-residential development. And then in Tutela Heights at the bottom, the ASTCs add up to about $15,000 per single or semi, and total $39,000 after layering in those citywide charges. And then the non-residential ASTC is $69 per square meter, and then a total of $149 per square meter with the citywide charges layered in. Next slide, please. Now this just shows a comparison of the current citywide charges with the total rates that would apply in our two ASTC areas. The current citywide charge is about $24,000 per single or semi-detached unit, compared with the total of $50,000 that would apply in the northern area and $39,000 in Tutela Heights. And then a similar differential is seen across the other unit types and the non-residential charge as well. And then just moving on. And now just to bring it into context with other comparators, particularly other municipalities with greenfield area ASDCs, keeping in mind that every area has unique circumstances and servicing needs. The calculated rates are in line with many other places. Windsor here is a particularly good example. They've recently introduced an ASTC for the annexed area of Sandwich South, and you can see the charge there is also in the $50,000 range per single detached unit, similar to what we have calculated in Brantford. Next slide. And now this just shows the non-residential side where we see quite similar results in terms of the comparators. And then next slide, please. Now, in terms of next steps, our target date for council passage of the ASDC bylaw is about a month from now at the April 27th meeting. We've worked towards that key date to ensure that a bylaw is in place prior to or in line with provincial approval of the new official plan and in advance of development applications coming in. In the meantime, over the next few weeks, we will be receiving and responding to any comments, amending the background study as needed, and refining and finalizing the bylaw prior to passage. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Councillor Carpenter, you're first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for an in-depth study. I enjoy reading these type of things, believe it or not. But I have a couple of questions. One would be the 49,966. That is inclusive of the 24,079, is it not?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so that, and the same thing with the actual development charges of 14,968 added to the current development charges give us the 39,047 for Tutela Heights. And we only did water and wastewater and groundwater, surface water as part of this study. That'd be correct? Oh, roads, sorry, roads.
Yes, a very limited capital program for roads as well.
Yeah, so the rest would get picked up, like our libraries and our fire stations and so forth get picked up when we do the overall study in Q3, which would go across all the full city, including the expansion lands, right? That'd be clear. That'd be correct.
Yes, that's correct. So all those services will continue to be levied on a citywide basis.
Would that be the time then that we would look at the banks along Tutela Heights, that we've taken Tutela Heights into our boundaries and the risk of the banks, and we would put in a capital program for those.
So that's something that we can investigate with staff. It's not something that we've discussed specifically, but if it is infrastructure that is eligible for recovery through development charges, and it's something that staff are continuing to work on in terms of costing, there is an opportunity to go in and amend the ASDC background study or reevaluate whether those costs would be included within the ASDC study or the citywide study.
But all the developers across the city would have to pay for, what is, we took that land in, and then we have a risk of the banks and caving in all along that Tutela Heights. That would become all the developers would pay for that as opposed to area rated for the Tutela Heights area. Would that be a fair statement?
We'll have to investigate with staff as we move through the citywide study. I'm not sure, we haven't gone into detail with staff on those costs and those needs.
Okay, one final question then. When we do the third quarter review of all the development charges across the city, then we'll do a more detailed study on the roads at that time?
Yes, so we view roads as being generally citywide in terms of planning and driven by overall population and employment growth. And that's why it's more difficult to define a benefiting area for roads than services like water and wastewater, which have a very defined benefiting area. So that's why we have quite a limited capital program for roads here, just limited to roads that are very much associated with the northern boundary expansion lands. When we move through the citywide DC study, there will be a much more detailed roads capital program involved with that, in line with the transportation master plan.
I do have one more question. How much time have I got, Mr. Chairman?
Because this is a hearing, there's no time limits.
Good. Okay, then my next question then would be, I noticed that the water servicing cost, 125 million, is pretty high, but when I went to the report, I noticed a number of pumping stations that retrofits are required here, and pumping stations are, can come to $5, $4, and $3 million a piece. There's a significant number of pumping stations. Is that because of the topographical area that we're talking about north of Power Line?
So I would defer to engineering staff for an explanation of those costs. We weren't involved in the costing or the master servicing plan process.
Okay, but pumping stations typically cost an awful lot of money. But we can only collect development charges from those ones. They're salvy.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the pumping stations are, you're right, Councillor Carpenter, it's elevation related, so low-lying areas you need to pump it. So it depends on the topography and the area where we're collecting. That's how the pumping stations were determined, where it should be and how many. And I see we're collecting for most of them, and I appreciate that they're all included. Staff's done a good job there, but we only can collect for these pumping stations first go around, right? Then the taxpayers got to pay for it second round. It's always rate study. The tax doesn't pay for water and wastewater. Yeah. And so that's, I think you do mean that's the rate. So operating maintenance costs in the future, yes, Councillor, you're right. It is paid out of rates for operating and maintaining.
And in replacement, but that doesn't
any repairs.
And that doesn't preclude the developer from front loading these things as well. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Slush, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, when we do the review of the third quarter citywide, will that put us more in line? Like, we're woefully behind other cities as far as our DCs citywide, whether it be residential or commercial and industrial. We're at the bottom of the heap. Is that a conscious decision that we had made, or what factors into that?
Julie, I'll have a first answer at that. Through the chair, yes, to the councillor, we have always largely maximized the funding opportunities. You're not dissimilar to some other sort of more mature urban centers where the charges can be a little bit lower comparing to places like Windsor. But certainly we're expecting, as the TMP has now been updated, that there'll be some pressure on the road side of things. So, and the other services will continue to look to opportunities to ensure that we're setting those rates to fund the appropriate shares of the capital program. So there's the expectation that there'll be upward pressure on the citywide rates as well as we go through the study, the balance of this year.
Okay, just if you just glance at the chart, we're extremely on the low end by like not a little bit, but by a lot. And I'm just wondering, is there funding that we're missing out on that we actually should be charging? Or is this because of the mature? Because like when I look at these cities, Kitchener's mature, Windsor's mature, Peterborough is mature, but we're still well below those.
I think if we look at the Windsor charges, their base citywide is fairly comparable to yours. We will definitely ensure that we're capturing all of the things that we can. We are restricted under the legislation for many of the services at not funding at levels greater than the 10-year historic service level average. That tends to place a cap on the charges for things like library and recreation. But we will once again ensure that we are doing that. And when we come back to you later in this year, we can more fully answer that question. Okay,
yeah, because we're not unlike all the other cities, they're capped as well. So there's something, systemically wrong when I look at those numbers. We just look too far out of whack with the rest of the world, that we don't seem to be charging what we can or what we should charge to get back what we need to get back in order to operate all the various services. So anyway, yeah, I would hope that the third quarter study will bring us back a number that looks more in line, at least in the middle of the pack. We certainly don't want to lead it, but we don't want to be in the bottom of it either. But I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sluss. Before I go to second time speakers, I have a couple questions. In your map that showed the new areas, the trigger lands were left as white. I'm assuming that some of those lands will come in before 2051. So has that been factored into the development charges as well as development for those areas?
I apologize. Are those the lands to the north that are shown in white in that map?
Yeah, there's the lands in orange. Like to the north of the city, there's the lands that are coming into the settlement area right away in orange. And then there's other lands that are white that are the trigger lands or not in the development area as yet. Eventually those lands will come in as well. Did the development charge look at the infrastructure needed for those areas as well?
So working with planning staff on this, the development needs to 2051 in these two benefiting areas were restricted to those two areas shown in the map. I'm not sure if those lands to the north are planned to be brought in to the urban boundary after that point. Perhaps planning staff would be able to comment on that.
Hi, yes, thank you, Julia. So through to Chair Martin. So overall, the infrastructure needs were looked at across the entire boundary expansion lands, but taking into consideration that within the planning horizon of the official plan, we do not anticipate that at this time the lands in the trigger area will be needed to support growth based on population and employment projections as per the provincial forecasts. Should those forecasts change or we find ourselves in a situation where we need to consider additional lands to support growth, then I would suggest that we would be looking again to what those infrastructures needs would be at that time and revisiting whether or not updates to further area specific DCs would be required at that time.
Okay, and the infrastructure that's being put in place with this is sized appropriately for bringing those trigger lands in later, I assume.
Yes, that's correct. I can defer that to public works staff, but ultimately we did consider the full build out of the expansion lands and the infrastructure required.
Great, thank you very much. Councillor Carpenter, second time.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. You highlighted that when you said the 10-year service level agreement. Can staff provide all council members with what the value is of the 10-year service level and why it needs to be in our program for us to actually use it as a calculation for development charges so we can understand budgeting a little better going forward. And secondly, could you tell me why we didn't use Brant County, as which is a city, not a county, that surrounds us, as one of our comparators? And that's it for me.
For the comparators, we were trying to include municipalities that have sort of a mix of newly expanded areas as well as an older urban center. And so certainly when we move through to do the citywide update, we will include Brant County on the list of the comparable municipalities, looking at both the citywide and comparing them also with those charges in the annexed areas or the new proposed area specifics.
Councillor Sluts, second time.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not clear on the trigger land. To justify annexing what we annexed, we had to demonstrate a need for that up to 2051. And now we're saying that we're not factoring in the infrastructure needed to do that until after 2051 because we don't think it'll be needed. Those are two opposing views that are supposed to be identical. Can you explain to me how that works? The trigger lands are to be triggered ahead of 2051 in order to satisfy the study we had to do to demonstrate that we needed that much land at this time to get us through that planning horizon.
So further to the chair, to the councillor. So as I had mentioned, when we looked at the boundary expansion lands, we did consider the infrastructure needs for the entire build out. But we do have to remember that the proposed settlement area that council approved through the draft official plan represents the planning horizon till 2051. And we do have opportunity to revisit that plan, revisit our growth needs based on population and employment growth, as well as the future or the rate of the build out of those lands. But those lands are not contemplated now for growth. They will remain agricultural and they are not being redesignated for urban purposes at this time. So we would need to revisit them through an updated DC study to apply an appropriate DC rate at that time that they're needed for future growth.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no more questions at this time, committee would open the floor to members of the public seeking to speak to the item. Due to the virtual format, members of the public would register prior to the meeting and join virtually. We have one registered member of the public to participate in the public hearing. I will now call Marcus of Cachet Developments to come forward and speak to the development charges bylaw. Whenever you're ready, Marcus.
Oh, thank you, Councillor. Good evening, councillors, staff. Appreciate your time this evening. Thank you for the opportunity. I also appreciate the level of work that's gone into both the official plan as well as some of the background studies. We commend staff and yourselves for that process and for, I guess, a congratulations is in order as well for the adoption of that plan just a short while ago. So our congratulations to you on that. With respect to the background study and the DC development charge background study and bylaw, just for context, I'm here on behalf of the Tutela Heights West block plan area. In a very short period of time, we've managed to assemble just over 85% of the landowners in that block plan area. We've been working collaboratively over the past, I'd say, 3 to 4 weeks to assemble a concept block plan that was recently submitted to staff for a future pre-consultation meeting. And in addition to that, we've obviously received the background study. We've started to review it. But in addition to that, we've gone out and retained our own consultant, Altus Group, to kind of provide us with a peer review and analysis of that background study. So what I'd like to ask for this evening, and in addition to what we've submitted in writing, is a little bit more time. I think what Julia had mentioned in her presentation was that there was an urgency to get the bylaw adopted by April, with development applications being imminent. I don't entirely disagree, but I would point out to council and to staff that there's a very detailed block planning process associated with these two areas, being Tutela Heights and the northern expansion lines. And that block plan process needs to be completed prior to any formal development applications being accepted. So I think there's a bit of time, and I would ask for just a little bit of time for us to undertake our due diligence and our review, and then sit down and have a meaningful discussion with staff and their consultant about the background study prior to it being adopted. And that's all I'd like to submit to council and staff. Thank you.
Are there any questions for the delegation? Councilor Carpenter, you're first.
Yes, welcome, Marcus. Why do you need the time, and how much time do you need, and how long have you already been working on it?
Thank you, Councilor Carpenter. To be honest, part of the exercise for us was assembling the landowner group, which we've done in a very short period of time, and obviously presented a plan to staff as well. We've already retained our consultants. We've given them the green light as of last week, and they've promised us some analysis in the next 2 weeks. So I would say in the next 10 days, we'll have a better idea of our position in relation to the background study, and be in a position to sit down with staff and have a more detailed discussion. So not a very long time. It would likely be before the adoption date, but obviously I'd like to allow for some buffering time to have those discussions, have those meetings with staff, and just ensure that we're having the right conversations before a pretty significant bylaw is implemented for two pretty important areas for the official plan going forward.
So would it be possible for us to keep that date, and as we get closer to that date, if there's a problem, then we can ask staff to move the date up a couple of weeks?
Yeah, to your point, if council and staff are okay with that, to keep it as a moving target or a fluid target, I think we would be okay with that as well. But again, I just don't see the absolute rush to get it done in April, with especially with these development applications being a fair ways out, given the block plan process. I think even if we were to say, to aim for a May date, would give us and staff plenty of time to have those discussions and ensure we discuss the right things going forward.
Well, I think there's some concern is when do development charges trigger? Do they trigger when you submit your block plan? And they trigger much earlier than they ever did before under new legislation. So whether they're not payable right away, but they're certainly trigger at a period of time. We don't want to get caught, in the middle there.
Absolutely. And Councillor, to that point, and maybe Nicole or Joe can speak to that, the block planning process doesn't necessarily represent a development application. It doesn't represent a draft plan approval or an official plan amendment or a zoning amendment. So with respect to the DC bylaw or the Development Charge Act, I don't think there's any correlation. Maybe staff can speak to that if I'm wrong, but I think holding off for a couple months is not really going to delay anything on the official plan or the development charge side for that matter. So that's kind of our position. We absolutely appreciate everything staff has done with the official plan and including this background study. We just really want to be able to have the right conversations and have the time to do it. So
So there is the review process, and then there's the appeal, possible appeal process after that, right? Okay, so
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, so that all those things would impinge on whether we have a plan coming forward. But we'll wait for see what staff say what can be done. Thank you for coming, Marcus.
Thank you, Councilor.
Seeing no other questions, I just have one. Is there anything in the report, Marcus, that you feel is a problem that needs to be looked at directly? Like, can you give us an example of where you think there's a problem?
I won't go into the specifics or the economics, but one of the things that caught our eye was the absorption rates that were being proposed. I think, up to after getting to about 80 units of absorption in 2026 or 2027, it scaled down significantly to 39 units per year between 2029 and 2051, which is, in our opinion, pretty low, considering the growth and absorption that's occurred in Brantford over the last 5 to 7 years, specifically in Shudlard Lane and across our sites as well. I mean, I think it bodes well for the city that much growth is occurring and that much absorption is occurring. So I think we'd like to look at some of those absorption rates a little bit more in a little more detail. But without having input from Altus, I can't really go into too much specifics. But I'd be able to speak more to those issues in the next coming weeks.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your participation. I will ask if the agent has any additional statements of clarification before this item is debated. I'm assuming the silence means no. I'll now ask Councillor Vanderstelt to move item 4.1.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Moved by myself, seconded by my ward mate, Councillor Weaver. That report 2021 251 titled 2021 area specific development charges background study statutory public meeting proposed area specific development charge rates and bylaw be received, and B, that a bylaw to adopt chapter 262 area specific development charges of the City of Brantford Municipal Code be presented to City Council for adoption.
Thank you. Any discussion on this item? Councillor Carpenter.
Thank you. Just the staff. We heard the delegation talk about absorption rates. Would it not be correct that the absorption rates are actually the rates that the province has said what our growth will be to 2051? Is there a staff person that could speak to that? Oh, sorry, Nicole. The delegation talked about absorption rates, which is growth rates. Are our growth rates not determined to us by the place to grow and by the province? They've given us what our growth targets will be.
The province does set the growth rates through the 5-year increments, and we also look to our historic planning and permitting data to determine the rates of growth within the city historically. I would suggest that we heard from the delegation that they will be preparing some documentation with respect to maybe some concerns that they have with the absorption rates, and then staff would be in a position to be able to respond once we were able to see, I guess, what their concerns may be with the rate of absorption that's been used to calculate sort of the overall build out of the area.
Would we be allowed under legislation to increase our absorption rates?
Well, I think the absorption rate is only a projection. I mean, ultimately, we determine what the ultimate build out would be based on, the rates of growth and historical data. I'm not certain that we would be able to change that rate of growth. I think it would be determined based on that historical and past use.
Okay, so we would just move it around from one part of the city to another then.
Well, I think what they're referring to is the rate of growth being slower or faster, not necessarily moving it around to different areas of the city.
Okay, and if it were fast, we would have taken in more land to accommodate growth to 2051. Would that not be fair?
If we were building out at a faster rate than projected, then absolutely yes, we would look to the additional lands that are not part of the trigger that were left out of this proposed settlement area, and then we would ultimately look to the trigger, which are intended to be sort of the last lands to develop within our municipal boundary.
Kind of like the Area 9. Okay, just wanted to throw that in there. Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you, Councillor Sluss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I threw you to Nicole. Nicole, the delegation was asking for time for a peer review, and he suggested, I guess, 2 cycles, that it would come back in May. Given the process that has to play out after the bylaw and the appeal process and everything to get us to the final result, Is that a doable thing from the city's point of view, or would that throw a real wrench into your system?
Ultimately, I can ask finance to chime in with respect to the overall alignment of this program, but I would say that as a municipality overall, we've worked quite hard to align our official plan approval with the ultimate approval of an area-specific DC to ensure that at the time that the official plan is approved, that we have those appropriate rates in place. I think if we were to delay today, we would ultimately be facing, we could be facing a scenario where we don't have those rates in place. And just to clarify, the delegate was speaking with respect to the residential lands, but the area specific DC is applicable to all lands within the expansion lands, including the employment lands, which are not subject to the block planning process. So I think that we've worked very hard to bring these two programs together to align them. And I would ultimately recommend that we continue with that alignment moving forward.
Appreciate that. And just finally, if I could, Mr. Chair, jog my memory. Are we normally appealed? Is that common practice for development community to appeal a DC bylaw?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there was an appeal on our 2014 bylaw. It was ultimately withdrawn by the person who had appealed prior to a decision being made.
So it's not commonplace then?
I can't speak industry-wide, but for the city, it's not been something that we typically see.
Right. Yeah, I meant our city. Sorry if I didn't phrase it right. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And just a question on the absorption rate. Does staff think that the rate that's been applied by the province is in keeping with our historical rates? Or do you think things are out of line there?
I think that at this point in time, I don't think we have enough data to determine whether or not they're in line. I would suggest that there has been indication that I think from a public perception side that they're low or slow, that the rate of growth is being documented as being slower. But at this point in time, I think we've done an appropriate job of looking at the ultimate build out of those lands and the timing associated with that using provincial data that we are required to apply.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no further questions or comments, we'll call the vote.
Item 4.1, 2021 Area Specific Development Charges Background is approved unanimously on a recorded vote. Those in favor, Councillors Vanderstelt, Sless, Martin, Wall, Van Tilburg, Carpenter, McCreary, Utley, and Weaver.
I'll just mention now, I forgot to mention at the start, we have regrets from Councillor Antosky and Mayor Davis. There are no notice of motions this evening. This meeting is now adjourned, and then we'll call to order the special city council meeting. Has the roll been taken by the clerk?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Members of council, are there any pecuniary interest to declare on items appearing on today's agenda? I see no conflicts. Councillor Utley, I understand you're the mover of the motion to move in camera. Please read your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Moved by myself and seconded by my ward mate, Councillor Sless, that council move in camera to consider the following: Sydenham Pearl environmental update and legal advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on the motion to move in camera? Seeing none, I'll call the vote on the motion.
Thank you. We'll be doing the vote by raise of hands. Please raise your hand if you're in favor of the motion before you. Those in favor, Councillors Weaver, Martin, Vanderstelt, McCreary, Wall, Van Tilburg, Utley, Councillor Sless, Councillor Carpenter. It's carried unanimously.
Thank you. We will now take a short minute recess to join the video conference link for the in-camera portion of the meeting. Members of council, please join the in-camera link provided to you. We will continue the meeting. Oh, sorry, that's